And for those of you who weren't here last time and don't know me, I'm Kat. I live in Brooklyn, New York. I'm an illustrator and an author, and I've spent the last handful of years researching tarot, the history of tarot, and the women who have contributed to its evolution, as Hugh mentioned. My email and my Instagram are here at the top of the slide. I am always available to answer questions about illustration or Pamela Colman Smith or tarot. So um, don't be shy and feel free to stay in touch after today. I always love to talk about this stuff to fellow enthusiasts. So, without further ado, let's kind of take it back a bit and start and talk about where this all started. So, this is the Rider-Waite-Smith Tarot deck, which I'm sure many of you probably recognize and know very well if you're at this talk. But in case you're not, it's the most popular tarot deck in the world, and an artist named Pamela Colman Smith created the illustrations for these cards. She was unfortunately not credited or compensated properly at the time that she made it in 1909, and then she was sort of forgotten for many years. So it's a pretty recent development that people are starting to acknowledge her work and her contribution to the deck in a real way. So you've probably seen these cards. There are 78 of them, a full deck of minor and major arcana. You've probably seen them whether you practice tarot or not, as they are some of the most widely recognized illustrations in the world. And that is what really inspired me to go down this path. I studied art history. I'm an illustrator myself. I was fascinated not only by Pamela Colman Smith's life, but also about, why in general illustration is often left out of the art historical narrative, and in particular tarot and mystical illustration. So when you think about the millions and millions of copies of this deck that have been sold, you realize that, wow, this is probably one of the most widely distributed works of art in history. Yet people often look at it as a commodity versus a piece of art. And I wanted to kind of change that and to tell the stories of these tarot creators and artists as historical figures that should be recognized, and we should honor their contribution to not only the world of tarot but to the art world at large. So that's a little bit of background. And so then a couple of years ago, I published my first book, The Queen of Wands, which is a graphic biography, sort of a graphic novel style format. And it was sort of my small way of making sure that this amazing artist gets the credit that she deserves, even if it's 100+ years later. This book was a culmination of many years of research, which started during my time in grad school at FIT, which is the Fashion Institute of Technology here in New York City. And then that work was eventually adapted into graphic novel style, illustrated and written by me, and then published by Renning Press. And this book chronicles the life story of Pamela, as well as kind of my discovery of tarot and the ways in which I personally relate to her. This book is still available at Watkins, I believe, if you want to learn more about her and her life story. And really cool fun fact, we confirmed during the last talk that Watkins is one of the first, if not the first shop that sold the Smith Tarot deck back in the early 1900s, which is just so awesome. And I created some special signed book plates that will be in the front cover of every Women of Tarot book that you buy at Watkins. So it's kind of like I was there in person to sign them, even though I wasn't. But again, I'm very, very honored to be here. So thank you. And then throughout my research on that book, The Queen of Wands, I discovered so many other figures that were relevant to tarot history. It really didn't stop at just Pamela. There was artwork, people, places, decks, all these different things that I was fascinated by. And I sort of kept a running list of things I wanted to research further. And eventually I had enough content to fill a book. So that became the book that we're here celebrating today, which tells the history of tarot, more comprehensive guide to the full history of tarot, and then 4 key women, which you see here, who made a big impact on that timeline. And telling their stories extended to even more than just tarot, to kind of include divinators and spiritually adventurous people in general who kind of helped pave the way for tarot to become what it is today. So even if some of those figures didn't practice tarot directly in their time, they helped to open up spiritual pathways for their communities in their own ways that ultimately helped tarot to become a mainstream practice as it is today. So, all in all, that research resulted in biographies of these main four women, as well as mini profiles on several mystical women from all over the world. There's no way I can talk about every person that's in the book in this talk. We just have an hour. So I'm going to focus on these four people, and you'll just have to read about the rest in the book to learn about the others, or maybe that can be a part two talk. But yeah, I'll just focus on these four, which are, of course, Marie Anne Lenormand, Pamela Colman Smith, Lady Frieda Harris, and Rachel Pollack. Now, the history of tarot is a bit hard to pin down, and there's a lot of contradictory information out there. So when I started my research, I actually created an illustrated timeline for myself to kind of keep track of things to the best of my ability. I'm a visual learner, and so this was the way that I could kind of keep my head on straight as I was going through the ages. And I decided to add it to the beginning of the book as well, because I thought maybe if it was helpful to me, it could potentially be helpful to readers to kind of sort out the timeline. So you go through the book chronologically, and kind of hit each woman on the road as they appear in history. And then at the beginning of the book, there's this timeline that you can refer back to. So yeah, like I said, as you read the book, the biographies appear chronologically, and we start with the Middle Ages, and then as we move throughout history, we eventually arrive at the 1700s. And first up, we have Marie Anne Lenormand. She was the first celebrity fortune teller in Paris, and in many ways, she paved the way for modern readers. She was born in 1772 in France. She was orphaned at a young age, and she was a bit of a difficult and rebellious child. So she was sent to a Benedictine convent to live with the nuns, which is kind of what you did with a difficult child at the time, if you could afford it. So here, I want to mention that it's sort of the fun and also challenging part of my job with this book is that for many of the people that I featured, photographs of them were either non-existent or very scarce. So I had to really consider how I would depict their lives, in the illustrations. I decided to draw the childhood or youth bedroom of each of their four women, their hands creating their deck or working with their cards, a scene from their adult lives, and then an illustration of their deck, which is kind of the legacy they left behind. And then a portrait, of course. So for each woman, I kind of did those five like full illustrations to sort of unify them all, whether or not I had like photographic references. So for Marie Anne, I included this illustration of what I imagined the view from her bedroom window could have looked like at the convent, with kind of Paris in the distance. And at the convent, she started to show signs of clairvoyance at a young age. She would make predictions about her classmates and the nuns that would ultimately come true. Of course, this was not taken very kindly by the nuns, so she would be punished for her premonitions, hence this kind of meager dinner of bread that you can see here in the illustration. Um, and when she was 14, so I'm talking that was a very, very young age where she was already showing signs of mediumship and clairvoyance. And when she was about 14, her stepmother couldn't afford her convent education anymore. So she was sort of sent out into the world to support herself. She was kind of not necessarily kicked out of the convent, but her education there came to an end, and she packed her bags and just left. She went to Paris on her own. She was only 14. And she's said to have been given a tarot deck by nomadic travelers. And so she kind of dove into teaching herself how to read cards and sort of tucked that knowledge into her back pocket for later. So already we see that she has the clairvoyant aspect, and now she's adding cards into that. That sort of divinatory knowledge that she has. She then got a job as a sales clerk and started to work with numbers. And it was here that she started to explore numerology. And so you can see she was kind of picking up different divination methods wherever she went and sort of storing them away for later. She eventually went on to open up her own shop on a very wealthy street in Paris, where she offered fortune telling, card reading, psychic readings, numerology, all of these different things that she picked up along the way. And it was a bit of a running joke that she would kind of get reported to the police, arrested, spend the night in jail, and then released again the next morning. And, through this, you can see that she kind of experienced a strange mix of acceptance by the wealthy people who would pay her for her services and supported her, but also, society at large that didn't accept her enough to not constantly get the cops called on her. What she was doing was still kind of considered illegal. So she was in this interesting sort of middle ground of success and, being considered a bit of a menace. So here's an illustration or a problem to society. And here's an illustration of her hands working with her cards. Um, I had to do a little bit of historical wardrobe research to try and emulate like what her sleeves and her jewelry could have looked like, what the cards that she might have used at the time could have looked like, which was maybe my favorite part of the whole process. So she's got her salon in this very wealthy part of Paris. She's kind of gaining success and popularity. And then the French Revolution really starts to ramp up. Violence is spreading throughout the country, and public executions, poverty, everything else that came along with that political unrest. And this is where Marie Anne's business really started to boom. People were scared, and they came to her for guidance. And she would use a mix of numerology, card reading, astrology, palmistry, a little bit of everything depending on the client to make predictions for people. And it was mostly for the noble class who wanted to know if they were next for the guillotine. Public executions were rampant. And I talk about this in the book. We see time and time again during periods of unrest in history, that's when people are, attracted to things like tarot, astrology, the occult, when people need guidance beyond what just the church can offer. And this is a perfect example of that. There was sort of this mass fear and unrest, and people were seeking help. They were seeking guidance, and she was there to offer it. So she ended up foretelling the beheading of King Louis XVI, which was when the general public really started to respect her. She was loyal to the monarchy, so if she were around today, we may not be friends. But she was a woman of she was a reflection of the times, and she even tried to save Marie Antoinette from prison, albeit unsuccessfully. So she had lots of friends in high places. Very interesting compared to her humble beginnings, considering that she paved her way entirely on her own. And she eventually became the personal tarot reader for Napoleon's wife, Josephine Bonaparte, who she made several accurate predictions for. She wrote several books and really popularized divination for the masses. So here she is in her salon with her cabinet of curiosities and her gray hound, who is allegedly named Aza. And I'm an animal lover, so whenever I found any information alluding to a pet, I had to add them in. And also, I just want to note here, I kind of put a disclaimer in the book that I'm retelling these stories to the best of my ability, cross-checking a lot of different sources of information. Um, but many sources say that Marie Anne, you know, she kind of wrote her own history. And so there are certain things that have just been contested over time, and we don't necessarily know if they're 100% accurate or not. And so we tell these stories and we kind of add those disclaimers and try to find as much evidence as possible. But I think that also the mystery of whether she really had a greyhound, or if that was just a story that she wrote, or what she looked like. Even some people described her as a little bit, scary, what you would expect maybe a fortune teller of the time to look like, with like taxidermied animals. And she was a little bit shrewd and a little bit creepy, and going into her shop was a real emotional experience. And then other people describe her as totally blending into society. Just a normal lady. You would never know that she had this, incredible clairvoyant ability if you just saw her at the market or on the street. So I just think that's really interesting to note. Um, Unless you were there, you don't really know for sure. But I have cited my sources in the book, and I've tried to use accurate information as much as possible. But it is, without photographs and without video footage, it is, sometimes difficult to know the full truth. But this is the truth as far as we know. So regardless, Marie Anne retired in her old age, and essentially we can credit her for paving the way for female fortune tellers to sort of be able to make a living when it wasn't so easy for women to do their own thing at that time. And she also, had so much wealth that she actually never married or had children, but she did have nieces and nephews, and she accumulated so much wealth that she was able to leave behind a pretty substantial estate for her niece, and help improve the life of that young girl as well. So after her deck, the Lenormand deck was produced in her honor. Here's an illustration of the Bluebird Lenormand deck, which I own. It's really fun to look at. It's much different than, a Rider-Waite-Smith based deck that, we may be more familiar with. It's a little bit more basic, a little bit more similar to playing cards. But that's just the style of deck that she used. And I think it's really fascinating to look at today. So that's Marie Anne Lenormand. And as we continue throughout history, there's more kind of history and mini profiles in between. But next up is our dear Pamela Colman Smith. She was born in Middlesex on February 16th, 1878. Her father was a merchant, and so the family traveled a lot. They often went between England, Brooklyn, where her parents were from, and Jamaica, where many people believe her mother's ancestors were from. Pamela was accepted to study art at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn when she was only 15 years old, which is a very prestigious art school. It's actually right in my neighborhood. I love that I can go there to that campus and kind of know that Pamela was there as well at one point. That's a really nice, like physical connection that I have to her. So yeah, she was only 15 years old, another kind of child prodigy similar to Marie Anne, when she was accepted into college. And she ended up having to leave before she graduated because her mother became ill, but she did complete 4 years of studies. And she was particularly interested in Japanese woodblock printing, which I think later when you look at her deck, you can kind of see that influence with the bold kind of black lines and the color fills. So after her time at Pratt, she traveled to Jamaica to care for her sick mother. And then after her mother's death, she was kind of tasked with helping her father run his house and also with finding a job of her own. Um, so here is how I imagined her bedroom in Jamaica could have looked, with her mango trees outside her window and her art materials and her beloved paper puppets that she would make on her desk. And during this time, she ran a kindergarten while she was in Jamaica, looking after like 100 children. And she created tons of art during this time. It was a very fertile, creative time for her. She would conduct puppet shows for the kids. She would build out the sets and the puppets all by herself. Kind of a woman of all skills. She was a storyteller, a performer, an artist, a caretaker, just a really multifaceted, interesting young woman. And she would do a lot of storytelling performances for her community there in Jamaica. She eventually moved back to England at the age of 21, and she built an independent life in London, in Battersea Park, not far from Watkins. So I imagine that you all too might have that nice physical connection to Pamela because she was around, probably in the places where you are sometimes, going to different shops and cafes and Watkins bookshop, potentially, which is just really, really cool. And in London, it was there in Battersea Park in her apartment where she created the legendary illustrations for the Rider-Waite-Smith deck in 1909. When she was working on that tarot deck, she completed 80 drawings in just shy of 6 months, which is an absolutely incredible feat, considering not only the quality of the work that she did, but also the impact of her artwork when we see that it's become kind of the gold standard for tarot decks since. You'll probably notice that most modern decks are kind of riffs on her imagery, just reimagined in a different way. So she really had an incredible impact, basically changing the course of tarot forever. She was commissioned by Arthur Edward Waite, who was an occultist and a fellow member of the Order of the Golden Dawn. He paid her, less than the equivalent of minimum wage at the time, unfortunately. Even though her work was so impactful, I guess neither of them knew what it would go on to become. And her name was also not included on the deck at the time that it was originally printed. But if you look closely at the cards, you'll see her signature in the lower right-hand corner, PCS. So she made sure to leave her mark on the cards in many ways. So here is my illustration of her hands working on the artwork for the Three of Swords with her kitty Snuffles. Again, any chance to add a little animal into the artwork, I'm going to take it. So it was said that she had a cat named Snuffles, and here he is. And at the age of 36, Pamela ended up relocating to the Lizard Peninsula in West Cornwall and settled into a much more isolated life. She did struggle a lot with financial insecurity throughout her life. And at this time, kind of in her late 30s and 40s and 50s, she did work odd jobs while caring for her companion, Nora Lake. So she had a pretty full plate with art making and kind of like nannying and storytelling at parties for cash and caring for her companion. Pamela and Nora lived together for decades, and though we don't know 100% for certain, it's mostly assumed that they were romantic partners. And they ultimately settled in Bude to be closer to Nora's relatives, where Pamela always continued to make art. And when she passed away at the age of 73, she left her estate to Nora, but tragically, her wish could not be fulfilled because of the amount of debt that she had accumulated. Um, so I wanted to add sort of, a sweet moment maybe in their life of it in this illustration form of Nora and Pamela looking out at the sea near their home. Um, and I will add that this is such like a little brief overview of Pamela's life. There's so much more that she did that I would love to talk about. So I encourage you to read more about her. Just like a really, really incredible, fascinating person. And in recent years, kind of with the rise of tarot and popular culture, there's also a newfound respect for her work. And the Rider-Waite-Smith deck still remains the most sold tarot deck in the world. And it's really clear that her, drawings, her easily digestible, accessible drawings have played a really large role in the way that tarot is consumed today. Before her deck, tarot was a bit harder to decode. A person needed to study a lot more. Decks were not even available to, be purchased by the public. They were often passed down within families, more wealthy families. They were kept a little bit secret by secret societies like the Order of the Golden Dawn. And so her deck was the first deck to be kind of sold at trade shows and markets and be publicly available. So it absolutely transformed the way that the public could consume tarot. And we can honor her by adding her name to the deck when we speak about it and calling it either the Smith deck or the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. So here's my illustration of her deck in kind of a modern setting. This was based on like a scene in my kitchen. Like the deck is just here with us now all the time, and that's pretty amazing. So I'm going to take a sip of water. I've been talking a lot. So next, we arrive at Lady Frieda Harris, who you're probably also a little bit familiar with too. I know it came up in conversation at our last talk. We were discussing a little bit about her. It's kind of hard to talk about Pamela and the Rider-Waite-Smith deck without also talking about the Thoth deck and Lady Frieda Harris that came a little bit later. But Lady Frieda was the noble woman who created the artwork for the Thoth deck with Aleister Crowley, which is the second most popular deck in the world. She was married to a politician, and she had a little bit of a higher social status than someone like Pamela would have. She had 2 children. She raised them and kind of lived that homemaker life, and then started to pursue her art again in her 40s. So she got started a little bit later, which is amazing. And that was around the 1920s at that point. And, because she had more financial stability, it's kind of hard not to compare both Pamela and Lady Frieda's paths, since they both worked with these famous occultists, right, who were actually rivals, Aleister Crowley and Arthur Edward Waite. And both women created these kind of history-making decks, but they had very different lives. And I think kind of the dynamic between the two of them was a major catalyst for me starting this project in the first place. I really wanted to kind of look at their different roles and their different lives and how they both arrived at the creation of their decks through different paths. So a little bit about her life. She was born in 1877 in London, just 1 year before Pamela. She had a middle class kind of English childhood with a private education, which included some art training. So that's where she learned how to paint at a young age. And she did show artistic promise. She showed a lot of talent as a young girl. Here's my interpretation of what her kind of bedroom could have looked like, with some of the subjects the proper young lady would have learned at the time, with London in the distance out of her window. So things like sewing and etiquette and art. And I will mention that, a lot of middle class young girls would have an art training. It was part of their education, but it wasn't really intended to become a career path, right? It was more of like a leisurely act that you could do, and part of what was considered a well-rounded education, without the expectation that a young girl would actually grow up to be like a professional artist. She would be expected to marry and have a family, right? So I think that that's important to note. And not too much is known about her childhood, but we do know that she went on to marry Percy Harris, who was a politician at the age of 24. He was somewhat of a radical liberal figure, and Lady Frieda herself was a suffragist, and the two worked together to try to make the political change that they believed in. They had 2 children, 2 boys, and as I mentioned, after Lady Frieda kind of raised their children at home, she then got them out of the house. She started to pursue her art again and really focus on her passions in her 40s. She met Aleister Crowley when she was 60. So again, you can compare that to Pamela Colman Smith, who created the Rider-Waite-Smith deck with Arthur Edward Waite when she was about 31. So Lady Frieda did a lot more living before she kind of took on this project. And she kind of urged Aleister Crowley to create a deck. Crowley, as you probably know, was a very unstable, kind of controversial, occultist, problematic personality. But Frieda kind of backed him both financially and emotionally to make this deck happen. So he wrote the Book of Thoth, which attempted to link tarot to ancient Egypt, and her artwork brought his book to life. So here she is studying Aleister Crowley's work on astrology before they created the deck together. She was his student. And, regardless of his many problems, she did really respect his work, and studied under him. So I think when you look at the deck, I believe Watkins sells it. It's really interesting artwork. Part of what makes the art so different than other decks, I believe, is that Frieda wasn't in a rush to make it. You know, unlike Pamela, who was sort of working for pay and needed to finish her deck quickly so she could get paid, Frieda took 5 years to make all of the paintings for the cards, right? That's a big difference from 6 months. So she had the time to integrate all of her sacred geometry training and her astrological studies and her occult studies to kind of envision a whole new deck. She also incorporated some Art Deco inspiration, which was, you know, a sign of the times, and also mathematical elements, which all combined makes the artwork super complex and unique and really interesting to look at. She also set out to kind of convey the essence of time, you know, the fourth dimension in the artwork, which really adds to that kind of magical element that the cards have. She created the artwork as paintings, which she kind of made in solitude at a studio out of town so that she could focus. And even though she was living a little bit far away, her husband and her maintained a solid relationship despite the distance. He was very supportive of her artistic pursuits. And yeah, she would create in solitude in the countryside. And she went on to kind of exhibit the paintings a few times to secure funding for the creation of the deck. World War II was ramping up at this point. Daily life was very much impacted by the war, and it was hard to get funding for a project like this. So she would often put her own finances on the line to keep it happening, and as well as like kind of having these exhibitions of the paintings while she was working to kind of show people this is what we're working on. This is why it's special. This is why you should take an interest in this project. So she was a very active proponent of this project. And she and Crowley, they had their kind of personal differences throughout the creation of the deck, or personal difficulties and differences, with plenty of, you know, disagreements and even threats of legal action on Crowley's part, which, if you know anything about him, it's probably not a surprise. But it seemed that they were able to resolve their differences by the time that the Book of Thoth guidebook was published in 1944. Lady Frieda died in 1962 while she was living in India studying meditation and Buddhism. So after her children were all grown up and her husband passed away, she moved to India and was studying Eastern philosophies and spiritual practices. And that's where she passed away. So the Thoth deck was published 7 years later in 1969. So both Lady Frieda and Aleister Crowley did not live to see its success, which is kind of similar to Pamela Colman Smith and Arthur Edward Waite. You know, they both died not having any idea how impactful their deck would be, you know, 100 years later, even. So, but in contrast to Pamela's kind of lack of credit on her deck, Lady Frieda does appear in the introduction to Crowley's guidebook for the deck, in which he says that she devoted her genius to the work. So he treated her in much higher regard than Pamela was treated by her collaborator. And I agree. I think her artistic genius is certainly what made this deck so very, very special. If you haven't seen it, I do suggest that you check it out. It's very fascinating. So there's a lot that happens between the time of Lady Frieda and modern tarot. But we are going to arrive now at the final of our four main women of tarot, who is Rachel Pollack, the incredible, amazing, iconic Rachel Pollack. She was born in 1945 in Brooklyn, New York, and she is considered one of the world's foremost authorities on the interpretation of tarot. She was a cherished member of the tarot community, as well as a brilliant author and artist. And sadly, she passed away last year. But I am very honored that I could tell her story in this way, by including her here in this book. And here's kind of what I imagine a kid's bedroom could have looked like in Brooklyn at the time, complete with an original Brooklyn Dodgers hat and a brownstone lined street at the window. She was a Brooklyn kid, and she was born to a Jewish family, and she went on to study English in college before kind of launching her writing career in 1971 with her first short fiction story. That same year, she also came out as transgender and queer, and she discovered the tarot. So it was a big year of transformation and growth and kind of coming into herself as a writer and living her truth. Um, so here she is at the age of 31. She received gender affirmation surgery while living in Holland. At that time, mistreatment of transgender people was widespread in the United States. It still is, you could argue. But at that point, it was not possible to receive gender affirmation surgery. So she traveled to Holland and did that under a trusted doctor that she had formed a relationship with. But in spite of the way that transgender people were treated at the time in the US, she did end up moving back to the US in the 90s, living her truth while kind of delving into her spiritual studies. So here she is in Amsterdam, surrounded by tulips, pink tulips, since pink is the color of healing and spirituality and inner peace. And in the 80s, so this is, a little bit before she moved back to the US and then into her time back, living in the United States. She was working for a long time and then eventually published her volume 78 Degrees of Wisdom, which remains one of the most influential books on card readings today. If you're interested in learning about, how to read tarot and how to decode the cards, I highly recommend her work. This book has helped decode the symbolism of tarot for thousands of readers with kind of a modern perspective. It sort of approaches the cards as images that can bring meaning into contemporary life for contemporary readers, rather just relying on that ancient lore. She was all about accessibility and wanted to kind of break down the meanings of the cards so that modern readers could get something out of it. Um, and essentially through that book and her other writing, her work was instrumental to the tarot revival of the 1980s and kind of earned her the moniker the mother of modern tarot, which is very well deserved. She went on to write 12 books, which have been translated into 16 languages, and they continue to serve as invaluable learning tools for readers all over the world, including myself. And in addition to researching and writing about tarot as though all that work weren't enough, I have to mention her career as a science fiction author. She wrote and published several science fiction novels, which usually depicted female heroines. And it was so cool. Like, that was maybe the funnest part of my job, was that I got to like read all her books, because if I wanted to write about her, I felt that I had to read her science fiction as well as her work on tarot. And they are wild and really, really cool. I recommend An Unquenchable Fire if you've never read her science fiction work. I think that's a cool place to start. Um, but not only that, I have to mention probably her coolest accomplishment was that she worked as a writer for DC Comics on the Doom Patrol series, through which she created the first openly transgender superhero named Coagula. I mean, come on, that's so cool. She was a champion for LGBTQIA plus rights her entire life and an avid transgender advocate. And that superhero really opened doors for so many people. Um, and something that I've been thinking about for years is the way she likened tarot cards to comics. I create comics as well. And the more I compare and think about the two art forms, tarot and comics, the more I see what she means, and I see how intrinsically linked they are. Um, she said that every tarot card has kind of a story arc, a beginning and a middle and end, which a successful comic should have as well. And then even like visually, they both have borders. They're both combinations of text and images. They both usually have like a hero or a heroine or a villain. It's just really, once you start thinking about it, you can't go back. I think it's really, really fascinating. And Pam Grossman, who does the Witch Wave podcast, did an incredible interview with her back in 2020, I believe. She talks a little bit more about that relationship that she sees comics and tarot having, and I highly recommend that, listening to that episode. So yeah, that's Rachel. In 1992, she created her own deck, the Shining Woman Tarot, which she later re-released as the Shining Tribe Tarot. This deck was the culmination of years of research of prehistoric art, goddess lore, Jungian psychology. It's heavily inspired by nature. It really expands on traditional tarot symbolism and makes it a much more inclusive practice. I've been using this deck a lot, and I really love it because it's so different than the Rider-Waite-Smith um, system. The first few times you kind of have to read the guidebook that goes along with it to sort of understand the flow, and it's really nice because it sort of replaces a lot of the heteronormative figures from traditional decks with things that are beyond gender. So things from nature, like trees and rivers and mountains and flowers. And I think it is much more inclusive, and it's a little bit dreamier and more imaginative, and feels like you're connecting to something really much bigger than yourself. I think it's a really beautiful deck, and she created the artwork for it. Oh, I didn't mention this illustration is my interpretation of her creating some of the artwork for the deck in her upstate house, her house in upstate New York. So yeah, Rachel taught for decades. Again, this is just a tiny little summary of her life. I highly encourage anybody who's interested in her to really delve into her books and her other work. She just accomplished so much. She did tons of lectures and community engagement, which you can find on YouTube, all while maintaining kind of this award-winning writing career and working as a professor of writing until her retirement. She was so prolific. She was a true pioneer for making tarot accessible to anyone who wished to use it. And she left us with an incredibly vast body of work. So thank you so much to Rachel. And so after Rachel's section, the book goes into how modern tarot readers and artists are utilizing tarot today. There are so many decks out there for so many different purposes. I think that right now, tarot readers and artists are really aiming to totally reinterpret the standard model and see what else tarot could become, which is really beautiful to see. As I mentioned before about times of unrest, societal, political, you see these surges in the popularity of tarot. And I think that's been happening certainly now since 2020, since the pandemic, since the election of Donald Trump's first election, going into this new election cycle. You really see that people, on a statistic level are, looking to tarot for answers, for guidance, for a sense of calm and peace in uncertain times. And I think with that comes more artists and readers who are reinterpreting what tarot means to them and how tarot can be applied to life in our age. So that's a bit where it ends up. I have a lot of recommendations in the back of the book for interesting and inclusive and kind of new ways of looking at tarot. Some makers and readers who are doing something new, which you can check out in the back of the book. And yeah, now I kind of want to say thank you for listening. And I'm not sure if we have time for questions. I think we have 10 minutes. So we can open it up to questions. And if we run out of time, always feel free to email me or Instagram me if you want to chat more. Yeah, that's a really interesting take. I love that. And yeah, I added I kind of mentioned in the book, like, tarot was connected to ancient Egypt a couple of times, and that was an erroneous connection. It did not begin in ancient Egypt. And so it actually didn't, come about. The earliest known record we have wasn't until the Middle Ages. It was in the Middle East, but it was not really in Egypt. Like, well, all these people talked about how tarot came from ancient Egypt for so many years. Let's talk about a real ancient Egyptian, Nefertiti, who was spiritually adventurous and really kind of rebelled outside of the spiritual norm of her time to create a new pathway for her kind of community and her followers. And let's do her like a little bit of justice instead of just sort of falsely claiming that tarot comes from ancient Egypt. But I think it is interesting because people thought that tarot came from ancient Egypt for so long, ancient Egyptian symbology did end up in tarot cards over and over, as you mentioned. And so it's almost like this false history, but it's still a history because artists interpreted it that way, if that makes sense. So, yeah. And I think, especially like the animal symbolism that you mentioned, really, really fascinating. But yes, Robert Place did a very interesting interview with Biddy Tarot, with Bridget Esselmont of Biddy Tarot, which I think you can find on Spotify or YouTube, where he does talk about how it was probably impossible for tarot cards to be made of papyrus because it doesn't, you can't cut it down to little card sizes. So yeah, really, really fascinating stuff. Yeah, that's a great question. I think I was sort of mentioning the comparison and the contrast of Pamela Colman Smith and Lady Frieda Harris, and that's something that I knew writing Pamela's story. I knew kind of about the Thoth deck, but I wasn't as familiar with it. And so when I found out that the second most popular tarot deck had been also created by a woman artist, that right there was like enough, of a spark to send me down the path of researching Lady Frieda's life. And then when I found out they had so many parallels and that Aleister Crowley wanted to make the Thoth deck kind of as a rival to the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, I thought that that was so interesting and crazy. So yeah, that sent me down this whole path. And then I just came upon different people. I mean, that going into the Order of the Golden Dawn, of course, Moyna Mathers came up. It's rumored that she made a tarot deck of her own, but we don't really have like evidence of it. So I wanted to write about her, but I wasn't positive that she actually practiced tarot. So I kind of thought, oh, if I do this broader volume of women of tarot and mystics who were all kind of related to tarot in different ways, whether or not they actually practice tarot, they're all part of this bigger conversation. Then, I mean, it just started coming. As soon as you start to research about these secret societies and stuff, usually there was a woman behind the scenes who was kind of making everything function, as most things, most things in history. And yeah, I don't know. And then Marie Anne Lenormand was also somebody that I knew about for a while, and I wanted to tie her story into Pamela's in some way as well. So I think they all kind of came about at different times. I think Rachel Pollack was somebody that I found many years ago and was very fascinated by. And this book kind of gave me an excuse to write about her further. And so then I kind of had the opposite ends of the timeline, starting with Marie Anne Lenormand and ending with sort of modern times with Rachel Pollack. And then I had to do the research and fill in the gaps in between. So that's sort of how it came about. And as far as conducting the research itself, I found it really helpful to look at museum archives and kind of look at different start with the art of tarot and kind of work backward that way, kind of identifying the different decks and the different art forms, and then sort of trying to figure out where they came from and what their origin story was, and sort of how they were all connected. And podcasts, I mean, there are so many amazing interviews out there with people who know so much more than me, tarot experts who have been studying this stuff for their entire lives. So that was like I'm very lucky to have that sort of benefit of digital media on my side, being able to listen to these interviews and talks with some incredible experts. Mm. Yeah, thank you so much for your kind words and also for that question. I think they impacted me in so many ways. I'm probably going to be thinking about it for years and years. Seeing, I mean, each deck is like so much artwork to sort through. It takes so long to kind of look through every single card and meditate on it. So I have kind of like endless inspiration to work with. I did try to take colors from each person's deck and include them in their section. So like in Pamela's section, this is a blue color that she uses a lot in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. And so I incorporated that. So you'll see that each section of the book has a different color scheme. And those colors, I kind of took inspiration from that woman's artwork. Um, yeah, I mean, Pamela Colman Smith, I'm so inspired by her. I also feel connected to her in a lot of ways because I studied printmaking in college and she studied woodblock printmaking. And I don't think we have a similar style, but I think that we both use like kind of heavy ink lines and then add the color. So I would kind of, look to her for inspiration when I was making the art. Um, and she's actually really, I think we talked about this in the last talk. She kind of grew up in the theater. Her mother was an actress, and a lot of her kind of family friends and caregivers were actors. And she would just hang out in the theater with the adults in her lives, and she would draw the actors on stage. And she became really, really good at drawing people who were in motion really quickly. And that's something that I respect so very much. It's really hard to do. And so, kind of inspired by her, I keep a sketchbook that I draw people from in public when I'm maybe sitting on the subway in New York City or, at a concert. I'll try to draw people, and I'm not really good at it, but her level of expertise in that arena is something that's really inspiring. Thank you. Oh my gosh, that is awesome. I mean, that's also really wonderful because like her place of burial is not known, but her place of life is like the place where she had so many of her friends and parties and came into herself as an artist and as an adult. So that's really actually kind of beautiful that even though we don't know where she was laid to rest, we know where like her life happened. Yeah, that's such a good question. I think it could. That's something that Latvia that I really want to look into further, kind of as like a next thing, because tarot was such a European and North American phenomenon. And yeah, the reason why I included Teresa was because I wanted to, acknowledge that there were other forms of spiritualism happening in other parts of the world, whether or not they became famous to us, kind of North Americans or Europeans. And yeah, I don't even know like what the deal with Latteria is, but I've seen it many times. If you go to California and just go down like a flea market, go down the street, you see it everywhere in every shop, and people play it, and I have no idea like how old it is or where it originated from, but it's really interesting to me. And who knows what it will become? Maybe if you add enough kind of superstition, and it could become its own sort of divinatory game or tool as well. Thank you very, very much, and I hope you all enjoy the book. And like I said, get in touch if you want to chat more. I love to talk about this stuff, and I am always around to do so. Okay, have a good one. Bye.